The night Vivian Hart mocked my dress, the chandeliers above the ballroom gleamed like a constellation built to witness my humiliation. The gala was hers, her annual parade of perfection, hosted at the Astoria, a place where the marble floors reflected every whisper of ambition. I had spent 3 weeks sewing the gown I wore that night, ivory silk, hand-draped, lined with a storm-gray undertone that only revealed itself when I moved beneath the light. It wasn't extravagant, just deliberate, like me. When I arrived, she saw me before I saw her. Vivian's eyes had always been mirrors, bright, cruel, and fascinated by their own reflection. She approached, surrounded by people whose smiles cost more than my rent. Her gown was sequined, her laughter loud enough to draw cameras, and then, with that same effortless venom she'd perfected since we were 12, she said it, softly, but loud enough to be heard by the wrong ears. "Darling, did you make that yourself? How brave." Laughter fluttered around us like the rustle of silk. Someone touched her arm, amused. The word brave sliced deeper than any insult could. It wasn't mockery of my skills. It was dismissal of my place among them. I remember the burn that crawled up my neck, the warmth of shame pretending to be fever. I smiled because I was raised to be polite in public, even while being dismantled. The photographer caught her in mid-laugh, me in mid-blink, an image that would end up online by morning, captioned, "When fashion forgets the dress code." The irony was that Vivian had once worn dresses I made in secret, back when we were both broke, and she hadn't yet learned to speak in sponsorships. I slipped out onto the balcony after the champagne toast, needing air. The city stretched beneath me like a sheet of light, indifferent to my humiliation. I could still hear the music thudding through the walls, the rhythm of Vivian's triumph. Inside, she was being interviewed, describing her gala as a celebration of modern elegance. I wondered if she'd mentioned the friend she'd once promised to take to Paris, the one who had hand-stitched her first couture dress for a college fashion show. The cold November air felt cleaner than the ballroom's perfume. My hands shook as I held the glass. But the tremor wasn't sadness anymore. It was clarity. For years, I had told myself that loyalty meant endurance, that love for a friend required swallowing small cruelties until they became tolerable. That night, under the city lights, I realized tolerance had turned me invisible. I watched the limousine queue below, the glittering women stepping into cars like royalty. My reflection in the glass looked ghostly beside them, but I didn't look away. I studied my own face, the uneven eyeliner, the lipstick fading at the edges, the handmade gown wrinkled at the waist, and I thought, I look like someone about to begin again. When I went back inside, Vivian was giving her speech. She thanked designers, donors, and the creative minds who bring beauty to life. Her gaze found me across the room as she said it, and there was a flicker, half smirk, half challenge. Maybe she believed she had finished me. I stayed until the last applause, not because I wanted to, but because leaving early would have made her victory cleaner. When the final guests began to drift away, I walked past her without a word. She said, "Don't be a stranger," the same way a queen dismisses a servant. I didn't answer. Words felt too small for the kind of silence forming in my chest. On the subway ride home, I sat among strangers who smelled of winter coats and exhaustion. My phone buzzed with messages, friends asking if I was okay, someone tagging me in a post of the viral photo. I didn't open it. I deleted every image of that night before I even reached my stop. At home, I unzipped the gown carefully, laid it across my bed, and stared at the fabric until dawn. Somewhere between midnight and morning, the humiliation cooled into purpose. I threaded a new needle, not because I wanted to fix the dress, but because I needed to remember how control felt between my fingers. That night, I stopped designing for approval. I started designing for revenge. People like to pretend betrayal is a single moment, a clean cut. The truth is quieter. It begins years earlier, with small edits to the story you think you're in. When Vivian and I were 12, we watched runway videos on her parents' old computer, sound off so her mother wouldn't say they were too provocative. We sketched dresses in the margins of our homework. Hers were always loud, plunging necklines, impossible slits, rhinestones everywhere. Mine were structured, balanced, lines that curved where a body curved, fabric that moved like water. Back then, she didn't call my work brave. She called it genius, and made me repeat that word out loud so I'd practice accepting compliments like someone important. We grew up in different worlds. Even when we were sitting on the same carpet, her parents were legacy donors at museums. Mine argued in grocery store aisles about coupons. When she liked a dress in a magazine, her mother bought it. When I liked a dress, I tried to figure out how it was built. I used to take apart thrift store clothes and reverse engineer them, pinning fabric to my own body because I didn't have a mannequin. I bled on fabric so often from hidden needle pricks that I learned how to blot blood with peroxide before it set. We said we would move to Paris together when we turned 18. She said her last name would open doors. I said my work would keep them open. At 16, she entered a charity fashion show at her school. The designer who was supposed to make her gown dropped out 2 weeks before the event. She came to my apartment half crying, halfway furious, dramatic in a way only rich girls can afford to be. I stayed up until 3 a.m. for a week straight, draping navy satin over her frame, fitting, adjusting, ripping seams, starting again. My mother fed us reheated pasta and kept patting Vivian's hair like she was some rare pet we'd been allowed to borrow. The night of the show, Vivian walked that student runway like it was Paris Couture Week. People gasped. Actual gasps. You could feel the room shift toward her. Afterward, the headmistress clasped Vivian's hands and said, "You have taste." And Vivian smiled and said, "Thank you," like she had built it stitch by stitch. She didn't say my name. That was the first cut. I told myself it wasn't important. I told myself that friendship wasn't a ledger. I told myself that it didn't matter who got credit because we were a team, and teams don't itemize. We graduated. She moved into a glass and marble apartment paid for by her parents, transitional support, which was their polite way of saying, "We will fund your aesthetic until you marry correctly." I moved into a studio above a deli that always smelled faintly of onions and heat. She called it charming. She never spent the night. I took unpaid assistant work in a cramped midtown atelier, the kind of place that sells custom gowns to women who pronounce the word custom like a medical procedure. I steamed dresses for women who didn't look at me when they spoke to me. I logged fabric bolts. I learned where to buy silk under the table and how to fake hand finishing on a deadline. I watched, and I memorized. Vivian, meanwhile, discovered that beauty plus money equals access. She started getting invited to things. Openings, launches, previews. She met PR people who fed on proximity. Suddenly her face began showing up in party photos, chin tilted, clavicle angled, holding a glass of champagne like an accessory. She would send me links, followed by, "You're coming with me next time. Wear something killer. I'll say you're my stylist." My stylist. Not my friend. Second cut. It would be easy to say she changed when money touched her directly, but that's not true. Vivian always knew the currency of performance. She just went from a local stage to an international one. There was one night I still replay, even now. She had an event that mattered, which in her language meant cameras. She came to my place with a garment bag in panic. The dress the brand sent didn't fit. She couldn't breathe when she sat. The zipper threatened mutiny. She said, "Fix it, please, I can't not show up." I remade their dress in 4 hours. Do you understand what that means? I ripped out the side seams, rebuilt the internal structure, lowered the waist by 1/2 inch to lengthen her torso, opened the neckline just enough to frame her collarbones without crossing into vulgar. I stitched the new boning by hand, because machine work would have shown on camera. My fingers went numb twice. She watched in a mirror as I worked, almost worshipping her reflection. That photo ran in Style Signal the next day with the caption, "Vivian Hart dazzling in archival Carice atelier." Archival. As if some Parisian house had lifted her from a vault. Comments said she looked like old money royalty. I zoomed in on the underbust stitching in the published photo and recognized my own tension pattern. She texted me, "We won. We." By then, I understood the shape of what we were. She was becoming a brand. I was her quiet supply chain. The first time she called me lucky to know her, she said it laughing. "You don't even get how many doors will open for you just being near me," she said, sprawled on my couch like a spoiled cat. "You're welcome, honestly." I laughed with her. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. Muscle memory. Sometimes betrayal isn't dramatic. Sometimes it's a tone. So when people ask, and they will, "Wasn't she your best friend?" I can answer honestly, yes, she was my best friend. And she was also rehearsing how to stand on my throat while smiling. By the time she announced her gala, she didn't invite me as Elena, the girl who once stitched navy satin on a kitchen floor. She invited me as atmosphere, as one more piece of proof that she was the kind of woman who supports emerging talent. That night at the Astoria, the night she called my work brave, wasn't the beginning, it was the harvest. The atelier where I worked after the gala smelled like steam, chalk dust, and ambition. It wasn't glamorous, not even close. The windows were always fogged, the mannequins were missing fingers, and the iron hissed like it was alive. But to me, it was sacred ground. Every morning, I walked in knowing that the sound of scissors on fabric was the closest thing to prayer I had. After the humiliation at Vivienne's gala, I should have quit, hidden, maybe even chosen a different career. But instead, I buried myself in labor. Pain, when handled correctly, can become precision. I arrived early, stayed late, and let the rhythm of work erase everything except form and line. The atelier's owner, Madame Celeste, was a former couturier from Lyon, who believed every garment deserved a heartbeat. She had once dressed royalty, but now survived making wedding gowns for women who wanted to look expensive rather than loved. She didn't like me at first. She said I worked too quietly, as if silence were arrogance. But after she saw me alter a lace bodice without leaving a single pucker, she started leaving me tasks meant for senior tailors. One afternoon, she introduced me to a man who would change everything, Marco Santori. He was a legend in whispers, the tailor behind 3 fashion houses who never took public credit. He was visiting to consult on a private commission, and Celeste asked me to assist. Marco was older, Italian, and intimidating in that serene way that only mastery allows. His hands were marked with tiny scars, the history of 1,000 needles. He watched me baste a hem without speaking, then said in a voice both sharp and kind, "You don't sew, you sculpt." I remember blinking at him, unsure if he was mocking me, but he continued, "Anyone can stitch fabric. Few can translate emotion into thread. You, ragazza, are one of them." No one had ever spoken about my work like that, not even Vivienne, back when she still pretended admiration. The words cracked something open inside me. For months after that, Marco visited the atelier once or twice a week. He never praised easily, but when he did, it mattered. He taught me how to read tension in seams the way musicians read tone. He made me unlearn shortcuts and demanded I rebuild my patterns from zero. "Perfect," he would say, "is not a finish line. It's a conversation." Outside of work, my life remained painfully small. My apartment was still the same single room with a view of a brick wall. The nights were quiet except for the hum of the sewing machine. I didn't go out. I didn't post anything online. The world thought I had vanished, and I preferred it that way. But Vivienne hadn't vanished. Her face appeared everywhere. Billboards, interviews, charity galas, each event louder than the last. The woman who once borrowed my pins now borrowed prestige from anyone who could offer it. Her empire of appearances was expanding, and somewhere beneath the glitter, she was beginning to treat my silence as confirmation of her victory. Then one day, she called. The ringtone froze me mid-stitch. I hadn't heard her voice since the gala, but memory doesn't fade kindly. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. "Elena," she said, breathless. "God, it's been forever. Listen, I'm planning something new. A collaboration. I want you to design a piece for my next event. Something bold. Something that says forgiveness and forward. It would be so empowering for both of us." Empowering. The word tasted like metal. I told her I was busy. She laughed, thinking it was a joke. "Come on," she said. "Don't be dramatic. You're good at what you do, but people forget quickly. You need visibility, darling. Let me help you. Let her help me." I remember setting down my scissors slowly, the way one does when realizing the object in their hand is suddenly dangerous. My voice came out calm. "Thank you, Vivienne, but I don't need saving." She paused, thrown off by the new version of me, measured, detached, unreachable. "Well," she said after a long silence, "don't say I never offered." When the call ended, I stood there for a long time. Marco walked in then, reading my expression the way a surgeon reads symptoms. "A ghost from before?" he asked. I nodded. "An old one." He adjusted his glasses, then let her stay dead. From that day forward, I worked as if each stitch could erase her voice from my memory. Celeste started paying me under the table for private clients. Brides whispered my name to each other, calling me the invisible hand. Slowly, my savings grew. Slowly, so did my confidence. Late one night, while finishing a gown for a foreign princess, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My fingers were stained with graphite and silk powder. My eyes looked older, sharper. I realized something. Vivian had mocked my dress, but I was the one still creating. In fashion, trends die fast. But craft, that lives longer than applause. And somewhere deep down, I began to sense it. Revenge doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes it just needs patience stitched into every seam. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, disguised as civility. Subject line, "A night of legacy, you must come." It was from Vivian. Of course it was. The words were syrupy, practiced. She congratulated me on my quiet success, mentioned she'd heard whispers about the miracles I was creating at Celeste's atelier, and said she couldn't imagine her upcoming gala without me there. It was, she wrote, time to celebrate how far we've both come. I almost deleted it, but something inside me, part curiosity, part instinct, refused. When predators invite you to dinner, it's rarely for reconciliation. It's to confirm you're still prey. Still, I went. The weeks leading up to the event were sleepless. I told myself it wasn't revenge that drew me there. It was research. I wanted to see, up close, how the empire she'd built looked under the lights. I wanted to know exactly what kind of illusion I would one day eclipse. The dress I made was unlike anything I'd worn before. Midnight silk, asymmetrical neckline, sleeves hand-cut from translucent chiffon that caught light like smoke. I embroidered the hem with metallic thread, invisible unless you looked too closely, each stitch forming a phrase only I would ever read. She laughed at your dress. Marco noticed my focus. You're designing armor, he said. Yes, I answered. But it's meant to look like surrender. The night of the gala, I stood before my mirror for a long time before leaving. My reflection didn't look like someone seeking approval. It looked like someone preparing for a verdict she already knew. The event was held at the Palais d'Or, a glass and gold museum rented out for the occasion. From outside, the building shimmered like liquid champagne. Chauffeurs lined the entrance. Photographers lined the stairs. Vivian had always known how to weaponize beauty. When I entered, the air smelled of roses and sponsorship. The music hummed with the confidence of old money. I moved through the crowd quietly, watching the room tilt toward her laughter. She stood beneath a crystal installation, wrapped in scarlet satin, surrounded by cameras. The moment her eyes found mine, her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, long enough for me to see that she hadn't expected me to look untouchable. "Elena!" she exclaimed, recovering instantly, embracing me like a long-lost sister. The flashbulbs adored her. "You came. I wasn't sure after you humiliated me," she meant. "Of course," I said softly. "Wouldn't miss it." Her gaze flickered to my gown. "You've leveled up," she said, voice honeyed with condescension. "So sleek, so restrained." She hesitated, searching for a flaw, then smiled wider. "Still brave of you to wear your own work." The word brave again, like a curse stitched into my name. But I smiled. "You always taught me bravery, Vivian." Cameras clicked. The room inhaled the image of two women pretending harmony. I could feel the story forming behind every lens, the prodigy and the patron, the reunion of elegance. She fed on attention. I fed on restraint. During her speech, she thanked her guests, her sponsors, her dear friend Elena Moreau, whose artistry proves that creativity transcends circumstance. The audience applauded. I nodded politely, every muscle trained not to show the tremor in my hands. Later, I escaped to the powder room, locking the door behind me. I exhaled. My heart hammered like a trapped bird. The mirror reflected a woman composed of contradictions. Calm face, clenched fists. I ran my fingers along the hidden embroidery at the hem of my gown and felt its truth anchor me. When I returned, Vivian was posing for a magazine editor. "Darling," she said, beckoning me closer, "meet Léon Marchand, the artistic director of Maison Valcourt. He's a genius. You two will get along." The man turned, charming and unreadable. "I've heard of you," he said. "You work under Celeste, yes? She speaks highly of your hands." I blinked, startled. She does?" Vivian's smile tightened. The photographer was calling for her attention, and she hated being ignored. "Elena's talented," she said quickly. "She just needs direction." Leon's gaze didn't leave mine. "Talent doesn't need direction. It needs recognition." He handed me his card before turning away. "Call me." Vivian laughed, too brightly. "He says that to everyone." But I saw the flicker again, the same fear she'd hidden behind laughter years ago. For the rest of the night, I floated through conversations, polite but detached. When the lights dimmed for the final toast, I looked across the room and met her eyes. She was smiling for the cameras again, but this time, her gaze was sharp with calculation. By midnight, I was outside, heels in hand, the city wind wrapping around my bare shoulders. The invitation had been a trap, but she'd forgotten one thing. Traps reveal the hunter as much as the prey. I looked down at Léon's card between my fingers. The embossed gold letters glimmered under the streetlight. Maison Valcourt, the brand she worshipped, the world she'd been clawing to enter. And for the first time, I wondered what it would feel like to walk through that door before she ever could. And 3 weeks after the gala, I received a call from Maison Valcourt. The assistant's voice was calm, efficient, the tone of someone accustomed to deciding futures before breakfast. Monsieur Marchand requests a meeting, she said. He'd like to see your portfolio in person. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Valcourt headquarters. For a long time, I just stared at the phone. The world outside my window looked exactly the same. Gray, cold, ordinary. But something in the air had shifted. It felt like standing on the edge of a thread pulled tight between two cliffs. Ambition on one side, revenge on the other. That night, I stayed at the atelier long after everyone had gone. The city outside was quiet, except for the hiss of passing cars. I spread my sketches across the cutting table, the ones I'd been too afraid to show anyone. Designs made from sleepless nights, grief, and defiance. Garments that were less about fashion and more about control. Marco found me there at midnight, still sewing. He stood in the doorway with a cup of bitter espresso. "You're chasing ghosts again," he said. "Not ghosts," I answered. "Proof," he sighed. "Proof for who?" I didn't answer. The meeting at Valcourt was everything Vivienne's world pretended to be. Marble floors, silent elevators, assistants dressed like architecture. Léon Marchand met me in a glass-walled office that overlooked the city like a throne room. He flipped through my portfolio slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he stopped at a design I had drawn the night after the first gala. A gown shaped like a rebirth, soft at the top, armored at the waist. He smiled. "You sew emotion like it's architecture," he said. "Would you like to design for us?" For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't a full position, just a trial, a capsule collaboration for an upcoming campaign. But it was Valcourt, the brand Vivienne worshipped, the name she dropped at every event, the one she claimed would define modern elegance. When I left the building, the sky was blindingly blue. I wanted to call someone, to tell them that the years of invisible work had finally cracked open into light. But I didn't. I walked instead, past cafes where people laughed, past boutiques where dresses cost more than my rent. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt something darker creeping beneath the thrill. Fear. Success changes the air around you. People start watching again. 2 days later, it began. An anonymous fashion blog published a post titled, "The Copycat Seamstress, When Inspiration Becomes Theft." It featured side-by-side images of one of my recent gowns, and a dress Vivienne had worn months earlier, one she'd bought from another designer entirely. The resemblance was superficial, but the narrative was perfect. The betrayed friend turned jealous imitator. The timing was surgical. By evening, the story had spread across social media. The comments multiplied like mold. "She always wanted to be Vivienne. You can see it. Some people only rise by stealing. Who even is she?" Valcourt's PR office called me that night. Their tone was still polite, but colder. "We're investigating the situation," they said. "Until it's resolved, we'll pause all public association." Pause. The corporate synonym for exile. I sat on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by sketches that suddenly looked incriminating. Every thread felt heavy with accusation. The world that had just begun to open was now collapsing like cheap tulle under rain. I knew who had done it. Of course I did. The fingerprints were invisible but unmistakable. Vivienne had spent years perfecting the art of elegant destruction. This was her masterpiece. The next morning, gossip pages showed her giving interviews, face full of faux sorrow. "It's painful when creative friendships turn toxic," she told one magazine. "I just hope she finds her own voice." Her performance was flawless. For 3 days, I couldn't sleep. My inbox filled with cancellations, clients withdrawing, collaborations postponed. Celeste tried to comfort me, but even her faith wavered under the noise. "People forget quickly," she said. "Stay quiet. It will fade." But silence had already cost me enough. On the 4th day, I opened my laptop and drafted an email to Léon Marchand. I attached photos of every design I'd created over the past 3 years. Time-stamped, documented. I added sketches, prototypes, even receipts for the fabrics. I wrote one final line before sending. You once told me talent needs recognition. I'm ready to prove mine. Then, for the first time in weeks, I slept. The next morning, Léon called. Come to the studio, he said. We're not done. When I arrived, he was waiting with my portfolio on his desk. We know, he said simply. Her team planted it. Valcourt doesn't respond to noise. We respond to results. Finish your designs. The campaign launches next month. My throat tightened. I managed to whisper. You believe me? He smiled faintly. I don't believe in people. I believe in the work. Yours speaks loudly enough. That night, I worked until dawn. Not out of rage this time, but resolve. I wasn't just surviving Vivienne's sabotage. I was transforming it into thread, into form, into proof. Every stitch was a heartbeat. Every seam, a scar healed in silk. And for the first time I understood. Collapse isn't the opposite of creation. It's the moment before rebirth. The Maison Valcourt studio did not feel like a workplace. It felt like a cathedral of precision. Every surface gleamed. Every seamstress moved like choreography. There was no small talk, no perfume of ego, only the muted hum of creation and the rhythm of needles biting into silk. To step into that room was to step into devotion itself. When Léon Marchand introduced me as our new collaborator, no one clapped. Valcourt did not waste gestures on sentiment. Instead, they handed me a sketch pad, a ruler, and a deadline. 3 weeks, Léon said. A capsule of 6 gowns. The theme is reconstruction. Make the audience feel what survival looks like in fabric. He didn't know how literal that word would become. I lived in that studio for those 3 weeks. Slept on a couch between bolts of tulle. Ate baguettes so stale they could have doubled as weapons. My world shrank to measurements and muslin, to pins between my teeth and chalk lines that looked like lifelines. Each gown became a translation of what I'd endured. Humiliation turned into architecture. Grief turned into geometry. The first gown was made of fractured panels of ivory organza, stitched with metallic thread, like veins of gold running through broken porcelain. The second, deep violet silk, layered asymmetrically so it looked like it was shedding its own skin. The third was the boldest, matte black with a sheer overlay cut to resemble cracked glass. A wound turned ornamental. Léon visited every night at midnight. He'd stand silently behind me, watching the fabric take shape. You sew like you're building evidence, he said once. Maybe I am, I replied. He smiled. Good. Truth should be wearable. By the end of the second week, whispers began circulating. Someone from La Muse magazine had seen one of my prototypes and leaked it online. Anonymous Valcourt protégé redefining couture, the headline said. The post went viral before dawn, and just like that, the tide shifted. Vivienne's camp had been silent since her copycat stunt, but I knew her well enough to feel her discomfort rippling through the industry's gossip veins. Attention, once hers, was now drifting elsewhere, toward a nameless designer crafting gowns that made people feel. On the final night before the presentation, Léon stood beside me in the fitting room. Models were stepping in and out of gowns under the bright white lights. Tomorrow, he said, the world will want to know your name. Are you ready to give it to them? I looked at the mirror, at my reflection standing among the women wearing my work. For the first time, I saw not a seamstress, but an architect of reinvention. Yes, I said, I'm ready. The next day, Valcourt unveiled the collection in a private showing for editors and investors. It was not a spectacle. It was a confession. The models walked slowly, the gowns breathing like living creatures. When the last one appeared, the black dress with the cracked glass overlay, a hush fell over the room. I heard one editor whisper, "It's pain, but elegant." Afterward, Léon took the stage. This collection, he said, belongs to a designer who understands that beauty doesn't erase damage. It reframes it. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Elena Moreau. Applause rose like surf, restrained but inevitable. Cameras flashed. I stepped forward, spine straight, heart trembling beneath my ribs. Vivienne watched it all through a live stream. I knew because she texted me that evening. Vivienne, congratulations. You really are something. Me. Thank you. Vivienne. Valcourt, though. You know that was supposed to be my collaboration. Me. I didn't know, but maybe the right doors open for the right people. Minutes later, she posted a photo on her social media, herself in a silver gown, captioned, "Originals don't compete." The irony was almost poetic. The gown she wore was one of mine, a custom piece she'd bought anonymously 2 years earlier. My design, her attempt at reclaiming relevance. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The internet did it for me. Within hours, side-by-side comparisons filled timelines. Wait, isn't this Elena's? Vivian's dress looks familiar. By midnight, the narrative had turned. The same blogs that once called me a thief were now calling her unoriginal, desperate, past her peak. The next morning, Leon walked into my workspace with 2 coffees. "You planned this," he said, smirking. I looked up from the gown I was hemming. "No," I said softly. "I just designed honestly." The truth tends to reveal itself. He raised his cup. Then to honesty. We clinked paper cups like crystal flutes. The victory felt quiet, precise, almost private, the kind of revenge that doesn't need announcement because its echo travels further than words. That night, as I closed the atelier, I thought of Vivian at her vanity, scrolling through the digital wreckage of her own making. For the first time, I didn't feel hatred, just distance. She had mocked my dress at her gala. Now the world was dressing in my vision, and this was only the beginning. Success has a scent, warm fabric, flashbulbs, and something metallic underneath, like victory hiding a trace of blood. For weeks after the Valcourt presentation, my name began to circulate in places it had never been spoken before. Vogue, Harper's, Mode Contemporaine. I was no longer a rumor behind a seam. I was a headline stitched in capital letters. And with recognition came the inevitable. Vivian. She appeared first through intermediaries, stylists asking if I'd consider collaborating, PR agents suggesting friendly photo opportunities. I declined each one politely. Then, one morning, she walked into Maison Valcourt herself. The studio went silent the moment she entered. Even Léon paused mid-sentence, curiosity flickering in his eyes. Vivienne wore white, deliberate, of course, the color of innocence and reinvention. Her perfume preceded her by half a second, expensive and suffocating. "Elena," she said, smiling as if the years between us had been nothing but a pleasant intermission. "You're radiant. I knew you'd do something incredible one day." Léon glanced at me, a silent question hovering between us. I nodded once. I could handle this. "Vivienne," I said, my tone level. "You're early. Valcourt's not open for public tours until next season." Her smile barely wavered. "I'm here on business, actually. I've just signed with Sorel Luxe. They're planning a global relaunch, and I'm creative directing their campaign. I want you to design the centerpiece gown. The world adores redemption stories, don't you think?" "Redemption?" I almost laughed. She said it like a prayer she didn't understand. "You'd be paid well," she added quickly. "It would be good for both of us. 2 women proving there's no rivalry between art and success." Her words were polished, but I could hear the panic underneath. Her brand was slipping. Valcourt's name had eclipsed hers, and she knew it. She needed proximity to legitimacy again. Mine. I took a slow breath. "You want me to design for you?" She nodded eagerly. "For the campaign. For us." I considered her carefully. Her confidence was too bright, like a bulb about to burn out. I could have said no then and there. I could have closed the door and let her fade quietly into the background she'd once condemned me to. But revenge, when done properly, requires patience and proximity. "I'll think about it," I said. Her relief was instantaneous, almost pitiful. "Wonderful. Let's meet for dinner tomorrow. My treat. No photographers, just 2 friends catching up." Friends. The word tasted poisonous. After she left, Léon turned to me. "You're not actually considering it." "I am," I said. "Why?" "Because the only thing more satisfying than outgrowing a ghost," I replied, "is watching it crumble up close." The next evening, the restaurant shimmered in candlelight. Vivian arrived 20 minutes late, as always, a delay engineered to announce importance. The waiter greeted her by name. She ordered champagne before sitting down. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass. "To endings," I corrected gently, clinking mine against hers. She laughed. "Too loud, too brittle. You haven't changed." "No," I said. "I've just stopped apologizing." Over dinner, she laid out her plan. The Sorel Luxe relaunch would coincide with Fashion Week. She wanted me to design a gown that represented evolution, her word for survival rebranded as style. She envisioned press, partnerships, front-page forgiveness. She would parade my creation as proof of magnanimity. "I want the world to see that women can rise together," she said, eyes glistening with rehearsed sincerity. I nodded, already outlining the architecture of her downfall. "Send me the brief," I told her. "I'll create something unforgettable." When I returned to my apartment, I sat at my drafting table until dawn. The design came to me slowly, like memory unraveling. A gown in shades of pearl and ash, its bodice wrapped in sculpted silk ribbons that appeared to choke and release in alternating motion. A story disguised as couture, one woman strangled by her own vanity. Weeks passed. Vivian sent assistants, fabrics, even photographers. I worked in silence, every stitch a quiet intention. When the final fitting arrived, she stepped into the gown and gasped. "Elena," she whispered, staring at her reflection. "It's perfection." "Yes," I said. "It's honest." She didn't understand. She never had. The night of the Sorel Luxe relaunch was luminous. Cameras, champagne, a wall of flashbulbs. Vivienne stood at the center of it all, radiant in the gown that shimmered like smoke and mirrors. When the lights brightened for her speech, the fabric's inner lining, embroidered in metallic thread, caught the light for the first time. The words shimmered across her torso in delicate cursive, visible to every camera. "Brave enough to mock, never enough to become." A murmur swept the crowd. Vivian froze. The smile faltered. The cameras didn't. Every flash captured the revelation, her vanity wearing its confession like jewelry. And I watched, not from the front row, but from the shadows near the exit. The silence afterward wasn't satisfaction. It was closure. Clean, precise, complete. She had humiliated me once with a single word. Now, the world would whisper mine instead. By morning, the world had devoured her. The photo, that photo, was everywhere. Vivian Hart standing beneath the lights, wearing a gown that exposed her own cruelty in shimmering thread. Some called it art, others called it sabotage, but no one called it forgettable. The first wave hit social media before dawn. Screenshots, zoom-ins, think pieces. Is Vivian Hart the victim or the villain? When fashion bites back. The dress that ended an empire. Each headline twisted the knife a little differently, but they all carried the same image. Her face frozen mid-laugh, the metallic embroidery gleaming across her chest like a confession she couldn't take off. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window of my apartment, the city glowing beneath me, and watched the notifications multiply on my phone. Mentions, tags, interview requests. Everyone wanted to know if I had done it on purpose, if the message was real, if revenge could be worn. Leon called at sunrise. "Congratulations," he said. "You've managed to turn silence into spectacle." "I didn't plan for the cameras to catch the lining," I lied. He chuckled. "Of course you didn't. Still, Valcourt is delighted. You've become the face of fearless design. Enjoy it while it lasts. Fame burns fast." His approval should have thrilled me, but something hollow echoed underneath. Success felt different up close. Heavier, quieter, lonelier. By midday, Vivian's PR team released a statement claiming the dress was a creative misunderstanding. But damage travels faster than apology. Brands began to distance themselves. Sorel Luxe halted their campaign indefinitely. An anonymous insider leaked emails showing Vivian had insisted on controlling every aspect of the collaboration, even the embroidery. The irony was cinematic. She called me that evening. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won again. "Elena," she said, her voice cracking. "You've ruined me." I stayed silent. "Do you think this feels good?" she demanded. "Do you think you've won?" "No," I said softly. "I think I've ended something that should have died years ago." There was a long pause. Then, "You're just like me." The words landed like a slap. Not because they were cruel, but because part of me feared they might be true. After the call, I poured a glass of wine and stood before the mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the same seamstress who'd once been mocked in a borrowed ballroom. She looked composed, powerful, and faintly exhausted. The next morning, reporters waited outside Valcourt. I slipped in through the back, ignoring the questions that chased me like gnats. Inside, the atelier hummed as if nothing outside existed. Needles moved. Fabric sighed. Work continued. The only constant in a world built on spectacle. Celeste called that afternoon. Word of the scandal had reached even her quiet corner of the city. "You've created something dangerous," she said. Art should provoke, yes, but destruction leaves a stain. Be careful not to become what you escaped. Her warning lingered. I wanted to dismiss it, but I couldn't. There's a point where vindication starts to resemble vanity, and I could feel that line blurring beneath my feet. 2 days later, Léon summoned me to his office. "Valcourt wants you to lead a subline," he said. "Your name, your direction. Atelier Moreau by Valcourt. It's what every designer dreams of." "And Vivienne?" I asked. "Her contracts are collapsing. She'll survive, but smaller. The industry loves a scandal until it needs a scapegoat." He slid a document across the table, my future written in ink. I stared at it for a long time before signing. My hand didn't tremble, but my heart did. That evening, I walked through the city without disguise. Billboards showed my gowns. People turned to look. I should have felt triumphant, but all I felt was distance, like watching my life from behind glass. I thought of Vivienne in her penthouse, scrolling through headlines, drowning in her own reflections. For years, I'd imagined that image would satisfy me. Instead, it made me ache in places I didn't know still existed. Power doesn't heal humiliation. It only replaces the wound with a crown. That night, I returned to my studio. The silence was thick, expectant. I ran my hands over the fabrics on my table. Silk, organza, tulle, the same materials that had witnessed every stage of my transformation. I threaded a needle and began to sew, not for revenge this time, but for understanding. As the stitches multiplied, I whispered the truth to myself like a prayer. She mocked my dress to feel powerful. I ruined her to remember mine. And somewhere in that symmetry, I realized the revenge was finished. What came next would have to be something cleaner, not destruction, but design. Still, in quiet moments, I could hear her voice, faint as perfume. "You're just like me." And maybe, for one brief heartbeat, she wasn't entirely wrong. Winter arrived quietly, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The streets glittered with frost, and from the windows of Atelier Moreau, the world looked suspended, beautiful, motionless, unreal. My name now hung above the glass door in sleek gold letters. People stopped to photograph it, as if the sign itself had a story to tell. It did, just not one anyone would believe. Inside, my new team worked in reverent silence. Assistants, pattern makers, stylists, all of them precise, deferential, watching me with the wary admiration people reserve for those who've both triumphed and destroyed. I felt their gaze like a weight. They called me Madame Moreau, a title that sounded both regal and ancient. No one called me Elena anymore. Success changes how people pronounce your name. The first collection under my own label was titled Resurgence. Critics called it a manifesto in silk. The reviews used words like visionary and merciless. Orders flooded in. Valcourt's profits surged, and Léon smiled like a man watching an investment blossom. But beneath the applause, I felt something begin to hollow out inside me. At night, I still sewed alone. The habit of solitude was hard to unlearn. The sound of the needle had become a kind of heartbeat, the only rhythm that still felt honest. And sometimes, in the soft hum of the machine, I imagined another presence beside me, Vivienne. Not the glittering woman from magazines, but the one from our childhood, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, sketching with me under the dim light of her desk lamp. I could almost hear her laughter again, untainted, before the world taught her cruelty could be currency. One night, unable to sleep, I walked through the city to clear my thoughts. On a billboard near the Opera District, I saw her face, not in an ad, in a tabloid headline. Vivienne Hart speaks out after fashion scandal. The photograph was unflattering. The makeup too heavy, the eyes swollen from what the article called fatigue. I stood there for a long time, reading every cruel word. Her brand had collapsed. The investors had withdrawn. Her social circle had evaporated. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of her own fame. And yet, as I looked at her picture, a strange tenderness crept in, unwelcome, confusing. I had wished for her downfall, and I had received it. But revenge, once fulfilled, leaves a silence that echoes. Back at the atelier, I tried to drown that echo in work. The next collection came together flawlessly, but I felt detached from it, like an artist reproducing her own myth. My assistants whispered that I'd become inhumanly focused. They meant it as praise. I heard it as diagnosis. Then one morning, a letter arrived, handwritten. No logo, no signature, just a folded piece of paper slipped beneath the atelier door. Elena, you were right. I built everything to be admired, not to be loved. And when admiration left, there was nothing left of me to stay standing. But you always built to last. Take care of what you've made. Don't let it devour you too. V. I read it 3 times. The handwriting was unmistakable. I should have felt satisfaction, maybe even triumph. Instead, I sat there for an hour, staring at the note until the ink blurred from the heat of my hands. When Leon found me later that day, I was still holding it. Bad news? He asked. No, I said quietly. Just truth, written too late. That evening I canceled the rest of my meetings and walked alone through the snow. The cold bit at my cheeks, grounding me in a way that applause never could. I thought of Vivian somewhere across the city, maybe staring at the same winter sky, stripped of everything but honesty. For the first time, I didn't feel like her rival. I felt like her mirror, 2 reflections warped by ambition, both punished by the same need to be seen. When I reached home, I hung her letter on the wall above my sewing table, not as a trophy, but as a warning. Underneath it, I pinned a blank sheet of sketch paper, the beginning of something new, something softer. I didn't know what it would become yet, but I knew it would not be born from vengeance. That night, as snow fell against the window, I began to draw. The lines came slowly, like forgiveness taking shape, and for the first time in years, I felt my hands move without anger guiding them. The next season would not be about resurrection or revenge. It would be about release. Still, as I worked, I whispered one final truth into the quiet air. To outgrow your enemy is victory. To forgive them is freedom. And perhaps, after all this time, I was finally ready for both. And the invitation arrived printed on heavy cream paper, embossed in gold. Maison Valcourt presents The Retrospective, A Decade of Elena Moreau. It should have felt like triumph. A designer honored while still alive. A woman who had turned thread into legend. But when I read my own name in gilded letters, I felt something colder. Finality. The retrospective wasn't a celebration. It was a mirror being held up to everything I had become. Léon called it an industry coronation. They'll write about you for years, he said, smiling through his cigarette smoke. You're not just a designer anymore. You're mythology. Mythology. The word sounded like another word for ghost. The exhibition would feature my most iconic pieces, the Valcourt debut gowns, the Resurgence collection, and even the infamous Sorel Luxe dress, the one that had ended Vivian Hart's reign. I hadn't seen that gown since the scandal. It had been bought anonymously at auction, vanishing into some private collection. Now, it was returning to stand beneath museum lights, as if the story it carried could be displayed without consequence. In the weeks leading up to the opening, the atelier transformed into a vault of memory. Assistants catalogued old sketches. Archivists examined seams under white gloves. Every fabric I touched whispered its history. The fear, the hunger, the long nights I'd buried beneath my own perfection. One afternoon, as we unpacked garments for the exhibition, I found something I'd forgotten. The ivory dress I'd worn to Vivian's first gala, the one she had mocked. The silk had yellowed slightly, but the craftsmanship still held. I ran my fingers across its seams and felt the echo of that night, the laughter, the heat of shame, the vow I'd made to transform humiliation into legacy. A decade later, that vow had been fulfilled, but at what cost? When the night of the retrospective arrived, the museum glowed like a reliquary. Cameras, editors, designers, critics, the entire pantheon of fashion gathered beneath a canopy of light. I entered quietly through the side door, unannounced, and walked among my own ghosts. Each gown was displayed on mannequins sculpted to my exact measurements. The air smelled of preserved fabric and champagne. Visitors murmured reverently, calling my work transcendent, timeless, haunting. Their praise passed through me like smoke. At the far end of the gallery stood the Sorel Luxe gown. Beneath it, the curators had placed a small plaque, the dress that changed everything. The lining, that metallic phrase that had ruined a woman, shimmered faintly under the lights. I felt my pulse slow. I had thought I was long past guilt, but standing there, watching strangers admire the artistry of cruelty, I realized that history doesn't absolve, it curates. Behind me, a voice said, "Still beautiful, even when it hurts." I turned. Vivian stood there. Time had softened her, or maybe honesty had. The sharpness was gone. She wore no glitter, no armor, just a dark coat and calm eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The crowd drifted around us, unaware that the two halves of the same story were finally sharing the same room. "I wasn't sure you'd come," I said. "I almost didn't," she replied, but it felt wrong not to see it. We stood before the gown together. The silence between us was heavy but not hostile. "They call it your masterpiece," she said. "Funny, isn't it? The thing that destroyed me made you immortal." "I didn't mean to destroy you," I said. She smiled faintly. "Of course you did, but I deserved it." Her honesty disarmed me more than any apology could have. She glanced around the room. "You won, Elena. You got everything you wanted." I looked at the gowns, at the flawless symmetry of my success, and realized I didn't feel victorious, just finished. "Winning," I said softly, "feels a lot like losing, once the applause fades." Vivian nodded. "That's why I left. I don't design anymore. I teach now. Small classes. Young girls who still believe fabric can change their lives. They remind me of us." For the first time in years, I smiled without effort. "Maybe that's where the real legacy lives," I said. She touched the hem of the gown one last time. "Maybe," she whispered, and turned to leave. As she walked away, I felt something unspool inside me. Not regret, not relief, but release. The thread of our rivalry, stretched taut for years, finally snapped quietly in the space between us. I looked again at the gown, at the words stitched in silver that had once defined both our fates. Then I did something impulsive. I reached for the nearby scissors and cut a single thread loose. The museum staff gasped, but I didn't stop. One by one, I snipped away the letters until the sentence disappeared into silence. When I stepped back, the lining was blank again, clean, whole, anonymous. For the first time in a decade, I felt weightless. Maybe art wasn't meant to immortalize revenge. Maybe it was meant to make peace with the ruins it leaves behind. That night, I left before the final speeches, before the press could find me. Outside, the air was cold, clear, forgiving. I walked without direction, my name glowing behind me in gold on banners, until even that light vanished in the dark. And somewhere in that darkness, I began again. Spring arrived like forgiveness, slow, hesitant, but steady. The city thawed, and so did I. Months had passed since the retrospective, yet I hadn't returned to the atelier. Valcourt sent polite inquiries, journalists requested interviews, and students wrote letters asking for mentorship. I ignored them all. For the first time in my adult life, I allowed stillness to exist without guilt. I spent my mornings walking through Montmartre, unrecognizable in plain clothes, and my afternoons in a small rented studio that smelled of chalk and sunlight. The walls were bare except for one thing, Vivian's letter, now yellowed at the edges. It hung above my work table, an anchor against the temptation to chase legacy again. I wasn't done creating, but I was done performing. What I wanted now was simpler, quieter. So when I began sketching again, I didn't design for buyers or critics or runways. I designed for a single purpose: memory. The collection that formed beneath my hands over the next 6 months was unlike anything I'd ever made. 12 gowns, each one representing a chapter of my life: humiliation, ambition, triumph, regret, peace. I called it the heirloom. Instead of sequins and extravagance, I used raw silk, cotton, muslin, honest fabrics. I dyed them by hand in muted tones that resembled the fading of old photographs. Soft rose, storm blue, candle ivory. The stitches were visible, deliberate, imperfect. Each thread felt like a confession I had never dared to make aloud. I refused to let Valcourt exhibit it. "It isn't fashion," I told Léon when he visited the studio. "It's closure." He looked around, unimpressed. "Closure doesn't sell." "That's exactly why it matters," he sighed, lighting his cigarette. "You could still be at the top, Elena." "I already was," I replied, and it nearly killed everything human in me. He didn't argue again. When he left, I locked the door behind him and turned the sign to Atelier Privé. A week later, I received a letter from the École des Arts, Vivienne's school. They invited me to give a guest lecture on creative resilience. The irony didn't escape me. I hesitated, then accepted. When I arrived, she met me at the entrance. She looked different, softer around the eyes, her hair streaked with silver, her expression without armor. The rivalry was gone. What remained was something cleaner, quieter, almost sisterly. Her classroom was full of young designers, their sketchbooks open, eyes wide with the hunger I once carried like a flame. I spoke to them not about fame or revenge or perfection, but about survival, about how ambition could devour tenderness if you let it, about how creation meant nothing if it didn't heal you. When the lecture ended, Vivienne took me aside. "They adore you," she said. "You should teach." "Maybe I will," I answered. "But first, I need to finish something." I invited her to my studio the following month to see the heirloom. When she arrived, I guided her through the small space in silence. She touched the fabrics reverently, tracing the exposed seams, the faint irregularities that told their own story. "This is human," she said quietly. "That's the point." We stood before the final piece together, a gown of pale linen with a single embroidered phrase stitched across the hem. "To forgive is to return to yourself." Vivienne looked at me with tears in her eyes. "You should show this to the world." I shook my head. "No, this one isn't for them. It's for us." She understood. That evening, we shared a bottle of wine on the studio floor. Two women who had once built empires out of envy, now building peace out of simplicity. Outside, the sky dimmed to a violet hush, and for the first time since our names had been written in headlines, we laughed. Not as rivals, not as icons, but as women who had finally laid their ghosts to rest. Later, after she left, I locked the studio and stood alone among the gowns. The moonlight turned the fabric silver. I realized I no longer needed validation, applause, or even recognition. The art had done its job. It had returned me to myself. The next morning, I folded each dress carefully into linen boxes. No labels, no signatures, just dates and quiet notes about what each piece meant. I sent them to 12 small art schools across France anonymously, with a letter enclosed in every box. "This is for your students. Let them unmake it, remake it, ruin it, learn from it. Let them know that beauty lives not in perfection, but in persistence." When the last package was gone, the studio felt beautifully empty. The kind of empty that doesn't ache, the kind that prepares for something new. I took down Vivienne's letter from the wall, placed it in the final box, and sealed it with wax. Then, I opened the window, breathed in the city air, and whispered to no one in particular, "Let them begin where I ended." The breeze caught the edge of my sketches, scattering them like petals across the floor, and for once I didn't rush to gather them. I simply watched, smiling, as they drifted, uncontained, alive, free. And the day I closed the atelier, the sky was the color of unbleached canvas, pale, soft, waiting. There were no crowds, no speeches, no champagne flutes clinking in celebration. Just me, a needle, and a final piece of fabric folded neatly on the table. It was quiet enough to hear the city breathing through the open window, the low hum of traffic below blending with the whisper of thread sliding through cloth. This was how it had all begun, and I decided how it should end. I had spent months clearing the space, giving away fabrics, selling the machines, donating mannequins to schools. What remained was a single wooden table and one unfinished dress, ivory muslin, simple and unadorned. It wasn't meant for any collection, any show, any body but my own. My final act would not be public. It would be personal, one last conversation between my hands, and the art that had both saved and consumed me. I began sewing before dawn. Each stitch carried a memory, the laughter of the students at Vivienne's school, the late-night confessions over wine, the applause that once felt like oxygen but now echoed faintly, meaningless. Every pull of the thread felt like closure tightening its hold. By noon, the dress was complete, a long, clean silhouette with no embellishment. I tried it on and stood before the mirror. The reflection looking back at me was softer now. Older, yes, but unburdened. My face no longer demanded recognition. It simply existed. I thought of my mother then, a seamstress in a small town who had once told me, "A well-sewn hem is invisible, but it holds everything together." For years I'd misunderstood that. I thought visibility was the proof of worth, but now I understood. The most important work in life, as in art, often hides quietly in the seams. That afternoon, I took a train to the coast. I carried the dress in a linen bag and nothing else. The sea air hit me as soon as I stepped off the platform. Sharp, cleansing, infinite. I walked along the shore until I found a secluded cove where the tide whispered instead of roared. There, I laid the dress on the sand and let the wind play with its folds. For a long time, I just stood and watched. The waves reached out and retreated like hesitant hands. The fabric shifted, breathing with the wind, alive for a moment before stillness reclaimed it. I thought of all the lives that had touched mine, Leon's ambition, Vivienne's pride, my student's hope, and felt no bitterness, only gratitude. Every scar had been a thread in this final design. I took a needle from my pocket, threaded it with the last piece of silk I owned, pale blue, the color of distance, and stitched one final line across the hem. Just a word, nothing more. Enough. Then I placed the needle in the sand beside it and walked away. As I climbed the path back to the road, I didn't look back. Some creations belong to the world, others belong to the sea. Either way, they are no longer yours, once finished. By evening, I returned to my small apartment in Paris. The walls were bare, but peaceful. On the table sat a single envelope, postmarked weeks ago. Inside was a letter from one of the art schools I'd sent my heirloom gowns to. The handwriting was careful, youthful. Madame Moreau, we received your gift. The students unstitched it, studied it, argued over it, then made something new. They said it felt like learning directly from your hands. One of them embroidered a message inside her dress that made us all cry. It said, "Every masterpiece begins as a repair." I folded the letter carefully and smiled. That night, I lit a candle, made black coffee, and watched the city lights flicker across the Seine. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the pull to prove, to compete, to rise. I simply existed in the quiet rhythm of the moment, a woman who had outlived her ambition and found peace in its ashes. As the flame wavered, I imagined the tide carrying the muslin dress farther into the dark water, threads unraveling, the word enough dissolving into salt and light. There would be no memoir, no documentary, no exhibition named after me. But somewhere, in 12 small classrooms across France, young designers were touching fabric, learning the same truth I had nearly destroyed myself to understand, that creation is not about conquering, it's about connection. I extinguished the candle, the smoke curling upward like a sigh, and whispered into the dark, not as a promise, but as a farewell. May they sow with mercy. And in that silence, I felt the world finally stitch itself closed around me, seamless, weightless, whole.